Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to give you a brief welcome before we get started. I'm Maya Alanevsky, the Events and Outreach Manager here at the Center for Contemplative Mind in Society. I'm excited to welcome you to the second in our new series of contemplative practice webinars, By Heart, A Way of Knowing for This Time, with Dr. Richard Chess. These webinars intend to explore the relationship between contemplative practices and personal and social transformation, insight, and inspiration. We are so grateful to Rick for offering this practice today. Dr. Richard Chess is the Roy Carroll Professor of Honors Arts and Sciences at UNC Asheville. He has published 4 books of poetry: Takia, Chair in the Desert, Third Temple, and Love Nailed to the Doorpost. His essays are included in The Stars Shall Bend Their Voices, Poets' Favorite Hymns and Spiritual Songs, and 27 Views of Asheville, among others. For many years, he contributed to Good Letters, a blog hosted by Image, a journal of art, faith, mystery. He is now a contributor to the soon-to-launch blog Close Readings, hosted by Slant Books. He has served as the director of UNC Asheville's Center for Jewish Studies for 30 years. He is one of the founders of the UNC Asheville's Contemplative Inquiry Initiative. You can find out more about him and his work at richardchess.com. Thanks for being with us, Rick.
Thank you so much, Maya. I'm so honored and grateful to have this opportunity to spend an hour with everyone who is joining us this afternoon. So big thanks to all of you who are with us, and I hope you'll find this session to be of some interest and hopefully of some use, and maybe of some comfort, and maybe of a little bit of delight as well. So I would like to say a word or two about the title. I actually changed the subtitle of this presentation slightly, but the presentation, as you can see now, I hope, is called By Heart, for the work of getting a grip on certain fragile things. And so 2 things. First is that phrase, by heart. You know, when we talk about memorizing a text, prose or poetry, and we're going to focus on one short poem today, we talk about knowing it by heart. But what does that mean, to know something by heart? And how does that differ from knowing it by head, by mind, knowing it cognitively, knowing it in your memory? What does it mean to know it by heart? How does it get down into the heart to begin with? And what effect does it have on us when we know something by heart? What is our experience of knowing something by heart? So these are some of the questions that we'll touch on as we go through this session. And the second thing I want to comment on is that statement, for the work of getting a grip on certain fragile things. As you know, if you read the description for this talk, that is a statement that comes from a poem by John Hollander. I'll share that poem with you when we get toward the end of our time together. But as we all know, we are in the midst of experiencing a tremendous amount of fragility right now. We're also experiencing a tremendous amount of strength, strength that comes from our kindness, from our loving kindness, from our compassion, even physical strength to do what needs to be done to take care of ourselves, to take care of each other, and to try to tend to the best of our abilities to this fragile world and this fragile situation we find ourselves in. And so a question that we can ask is, how could knowing a poem by heart possibly be of use to us in tending to the fragility around us and within us? I'm not sure we'll get to answer that question, but we'll head in that direction. So just a brief word about what's going to happen over the next 50 minutes or 55 minutes or so. I'm going to try to frame a little bit this idea of getting to know something by heart, in our case, getting to know a short poem by heart. So I'm going to frame that in part and mostly by turning to a Jewish text that may have something to teach us about how we come to know something by heart. Then after 25 minutes or so, we're going to do the practice. We're going to memorize a very short poem. We're going to do a practice with it. The practice will include some quiet time, repeating the poem internally to ourselves. I'll say more about that in a minute, followed by an opportunity to write a little bit about the experience. And then we'll have a chance to reflect on that experience a little bit. And then in the final minutes, we'll come back. We'll get to that John Hollander poem, I'm 99% sure, and we'll wrap up. So here we go. For many of us in this contemplative community, our practices involve working with silence. Some of our practices involve working with visualization. Some of our practices involve working with movement. One thing that all these practices share with one another is that to one degree or another, they all involve words. Sometimes, even often, the words might come in the form of instructions. How to do this practice, where to direct our attention. When words are being used in this way, they're being used to transmit information. We could think of the words as containers or vessels. They're serving the only purpose of delivering the content, what's contained in those vessels. And once we get the content, maybe we don't need the words anymore. Oh, we may need to remember them once in a while so that we can set our attention, remember what we're supposed to be doing, etc. But the words themselves, we can kind of get rid of them. What if we paid as much attention to the containers and the vessels that deliver content as we do to the content itself? So that's another one of the questions that we want to hang with a little bit this afternoon. We want to think about, are there ways of organizing, of selecting and organizing and composing words, putting them together so that their content and their substance, their material, physical substance, can be a means of touching, entering, and opening the heart. And what do I mean by a word's substance? It's a word's material, physical substance. We can think about the sounds of words, the vowels and the consonants in relation to one another. We can think about the rhythms of phrases, of lines, of sentences. We can think about the pauses in between phrases, in between words, at the end of lines of a poem. Those are all part of kind of the material substance of language. And if we want to go in another direction, we could even think about the shapes of written language, of the alphabetic language. And we could do meditation practices focused on the shapes of the letters. That we're not going to do today. So poems are texts that in fact are designed, are created, are composed in such a way that the physical substance of the language is just as important as the denotative and connotative meanings of the words. And as such, they're designed to do one of the things that we're curious about this afternoon, and that is they're designed to touch, enter, and open the heart. So let's think about this phrase by heart for a moment or two. And here's a little passage from John Hollander. He has a wonderful little anthology called Committed to Memory. I'm going to give you a link to some of his introductory comments about that anthology and to some of the poems included in that anthology at the end of this afternoon's presentation. But here's one thing that he has to say about this very phrase by heart. We speak of memorizing as getting something by heart, which really means by head. But getting a poem or prose passage truly by heart implies getting it by mind and memory and understanding and delight. So I want to focus on 4 words in this passage: the word mind, memory, understanding, and delight. And of those 4 words, only one of them seems to speak directly to emotion, directly to the heart. Mind, memory, and understanding can and are all referring mostly to cognitive processes, to things that are happening in our heads, not in our hearts. So what role does delight play in our ability to get the words of a poem, a psalm, a hymn, another sacred text into our hearts? And can we get delight even from, let's say, sad poems or angry poems or bitter poems, poems of grief and of fear and of longing, right? Because sacred text and the so-called secular texts or whatever, they range across the full spectrum of possible human emotional, spiritual, psychological, intellectual experience. And I'd say that there's something in the way the language is used in poetry. And so many of our sacred texts are poems. That there's something about the language that even when it is presenting something that is terribly painful, there's some delight that comes along with it. And so what does the technology of language that produces delight have to do with our ability to both remember a poem and to have it by heart? Well, it's possible that the arousing of strong emotions, in fact, aids in the memory. And further, it's highly possible that the stimulating and arousing of strong emotion makes understanding of the intellectual content and the other levels of meaning in a poem possible. So those are some initial thoughts on the phrase by the heart and memorizing, often something we think of as going on in the head, but as we consider it now, we see, it also has to be taking place in the heart. So how does it get to the heart to begin with? How can the words get from the head into the heart? And so to explore that question briefly, I'd like to turn to a Jewish text, a paragraph. Right now you just see 2 verses in Hebrew. Don't worry, I'll read them aloud in a second. And the rest of the paragraph that begins with these 2 sentences, I'll present in the next slide transliterated, and we'll talk about it. But I'd like us to look at a little passage from Deuteronomy, verses 5 through 9. And it's a little passage that Jews chant twice a day after saying what's known as the Shema. And I suspect a fair number of you out there have heard of the Shema. The Shema goes Shema Yisrael, Yud He Vav He Eloheinu, Yud He Vav He Echad. And what the Shema is doing, it's kind of like telling us to like listen up, wake up, you Jews. Wake up, you Jews. Pay attention to this. Shema Yisrael. Pay attention. Yud He Vav He. YHVH. That's our God. Yud He Vav He is one. Right? So that's the Shema. And right after Jews chant that, then they go to this passage from Deuteronomy that begins, V'ahavta et Yud He Vav He Elohecha b'chol levavecha uv'chol nafshecha uv'chol meodecha v'hayu hadivarim ha'ele asher anochi metzavacha hayom al levavecha. By the way, I'm reading from right to left as Hebrew goes from right to left. So now a quick translation. V'ahavta, and you shall love. Wow. First word after saying the Shema, and you shall love. What shall you love? Et Yud He Vav He Elohecha. You shall love Yud He Vav He, your God. How? B'chol levavcha, with all your heart. Look at this emphasis on the heart. Uv'chol nafshecha, nefesh is one of the words in Judaism for soul. Uv'chol me'odecha, with all your strength. V'hayu hadivarim ha'ela. Now the second word, reading from the right of that second line, hadivarim, the root is a letter that makes a D sound, a letter that makes like a V sound, it's a soft B in Hebrew, and a letter that makes an R sound, daber, dibur, dever. That word means, among other things, word and thing. So here we get in this text already a sort of Jewish understanding that words have material substance. They are beings, they are entities. They're not just empty containers designed to deliver content, to transmit information. So in these words, that you shall love your God, Yud He Vav He, your God, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. These are the words, Asher Anochi Metzavacha Hayom, that God commands you today on your heart. Al livavecha. So that's really interesting, those last two words, al livavecha, on your heart. Why not in your heart? It's a question to kind of think about. And since Jews take Torah super seriously, rabbis have been thinking about that. Why does it say on your heart and not in your heart? So one rabbi, a Hasidic rabbi, the Kutzker Rebbe, Menachem Mendel of Kutz, who lived from 1787 to 1859, says, here's why on the heart and not in the heart. The heart, the Kutzker Rebbe says, is not always open. And so we should place these words, pile these words up on the heart, these words and other words of the sacred Torah on the heart, so that when the heart does open, these are the words that will fall inside. So how do we even get to the place where we're like piling up these words or the words of a poem or whatever on to the heart to begin with? And that's where we're going to turn, briefly to the rest of that passage from Deuteronomy 6, verses 5 through 9. So again, to repeat, V'hayu hadivarim ha'ele asher anochi metzavacha hayom al levavecha, on your heart. V'shinantam levanecha, and you shall repeat them to your children. V'dibarta bam, and you shall say them. Where? B'shivtecha b'veitecha, when you're sitting in your house. Uvlechtecha v'derech, when you're walking by the way. Uvshachbecha, when you're lying down at night to go to sleep. Uvkunecha, when you're rising up in the morning to begin the day. Ukshartam, and you shall bind them and fasten them, leot al yadecha, on your arm and your hand. The hayula totafot beinenecha, you shall also place them between your eyes. Uchtavtam al mezuzot, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house. Uvisharecha, and on the gates of your city. So the words that I highlighted, to me, suddenly when I started to look at them in the context of thinking about getting to know something by heart, I realized they're giving some instructions about how to get to know something by heart. We begin by placing things on the heart, those words on the heart. How do we get them there? By repeating them. Of course, when you're memorizing something, repeat, repeat, repeat over and over and over again. How to repeat, where to repeat, when to repeat. These are some questions that we want to consider. And that passage from Deuteronomy gives us some instructions. Vidipartam, say them when you're sitting in your house and when you're walking by the way, when you go to sleep at night and when you get up in the morning. Okay, you're trying to memorize something, get it on the heart so that it can enter the heart and open the heart. When should I repeat this thing I'm trying to memorize? When I'm at home and when I'm outside, when I'm going to sleep and when I'm waking up. Ukshartam, you should bind them on your arm and place them as a sign between your eyes. Okay, so Jews understand that to mean the phylacteries, the tefillin, that observant Jews wrap around their arm and hand and around their head. But we can think about embodying them. What kinds of actions can we take to actually embody words that we're trying to memorize and get into our heart? Uchtavtem, write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Of course, Jews do that with mezuzot, the entry to the house and the rooms in the house, and in Israel, for instance, on gates in the city, etc. But we can think of it more universally, thinking about locating the words in spaces, public and private, and actions, and in time. So these are some steps for ways to get a poem, the words of a poem or some other important text into our hearts. First, get them on the heart, get them from the head onto the heart. Then they may enter the heart. Here's another way of talking about the same thing. And this is just a short phrase from Norman Fisher's wonderful essay on Zen koan practice. The essay is called Phrases and Spaces. So here's what he has to say about working with phrases as a kind of phrase practice, a language-based contemplative practice. He talks about living with, penetrating, and being penetrated by phrases. So there's one new word in here for us to consider. Living with, we're talking about how do we live with these words to get them onto and into our heart. Being penetrated by, heart cracks open, get close enough to the words, spend enough time with them, they will penetrate us. What about that word penetrating? That suggests, like I said earlier, if we think of a word as a vessel or as a container, they're a space, they're an object that can be entered. And when we hang out enough with carefully chosen words, not only might we experience the feeling of living with them and being penetrated by them, but we might also have the experience of penetrating them, not only for the paraphrasable meaning of the words. So here we are, and now we're ready to turn to a little bit of practice. And so the steps, as I more or less outlined them at the beginning of our session, are as follows. In a minute, I'm going to show you a short poem, and I'm going to invite you to memorize it. It's not that many words, it's not that many lines. Obviously, we're not going to be able to say these words when we're walking by the way unless you're tuning into this webinar on your phone and you're out walking while you're paying attention to it. We're gonna, after we memorize them, we're gonna repeat them internally for a few minutes, maybe 4 minutes or so. And then I'm gonna give you an opportunity to write a little bit about what you noticed, and then we'll share a little bit with each other as much as possible. So I hope you're ready to go, and I'm gonna now, oh yeah, I wanna say one other thing, I'm sorry. I wanna say one other thing about doing this practice, repeating this short poem internally. It's our natural inclination when we engage with language to seek meaning. What does this mean? How does it apply to other things I know? How does it apply to the rest of my life? Especially in an academic setting, for those of you who are in an academic setting, that's what we're teaching our students to do all the time when they engage language. Interpret it, approach it as a good critical thinker. Wonderful, important, crucial, necessary skills and practices. But what if we shifted to a slightly different way of being with the language? And instead of seeking meaning, we opened ourselves up to the possibility of receiving meaning and insight. And that's what I'm going to invite us to do when we start doing this practice internally. That when you find yourself seeking, actively seeking meaning, my invitation to you is to notice that you're doing that, let go of it, and then go back into that receptive mode and just say the words over and over and over again. Again, to help us out, here's a little sentence, short sentence from Norman's book, Essay, Phrases, and Spaces, once again. He writes in the second sentence in this, instead of going out toward the phrases as if they weren't alive, wow, as if they weren't alive, interpreting or explaining them, seeking meaning, gaining mastery over them. And I have a whole lot I could say about this idea of gaining mastery over text and over words, but I'm not going to go there right now. But instead of going out toward the phrases, allow the phrases to come forward toward you. So those are our instructions. And now here's our poem. And I'd like to invite you, if you feel comfortable doing so wherever you are, to say the poem aloud. I'm going to read it aloud, and I'm going to invite you to say it aloud as well the first time. And then I'm going to give you like 2 minutes to memorize the poem. So here we go. We're going to say the poem aloud. Oh, by the way, this is a poem by the Italian poet Tralusa. That's his pen name. His birth name is Carlo Alberto Salustri, and it was translated from the Italian by John Duval. And as all good translations do, this poem lives as a poem in the English language. So it does not matter for what we're doing that it's translated from Italian into English. So here we go. On the count of 3, and a 1, and a 2, and a 3. A bee settled on a rose petal. It sipped and off it flew. All in all, happiness too is something little. Okay, so now take the next 2 minutes and try to memorize this poem. I'll give you about 2 minutes to do that. Okay, so let's now say the poem aloud together. If it's possible for you to join in, we'll do it one last time to really get the poem into our bodies. And so on the count of three, a 1 and a 2 and a 3, a bee settled on a rose petal. It sipped and off it flew. All in all, happiness too is something little. And now I'm going to invite you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing so, or soften your gaze and direct your attention within and begin saying the poem internally to yourself over and over and over again. If you find that you're actively seeking meaning, notice that that's what's happening, let it go, and go back to being in that more receptive mode and allow observations, insights, and meanings to come to you. So let's do this practice now for, let's say, 3.5 minutes. Let's go for 4. Let's go for 4 minutes. And I'll call you back when it's time to come back. So I invite you now to still sit with your eyes closed or your gaze softened, but just let go of the words now. And just sit quietly for the last few seconds and notice what you notice. And when you're ready, I invite you to open your eyes and bring your attention back to the webinar itself. Boy, would I love to be in the same place with you all physically to kind of hear, after the next step, what you experienced. But we're going to do it the way we have to do it by our distant and digital connections. I'd like to invite you now to find something to write on, to write in. Hopefully don't go away too far. And I'd like you to just jot down quickly some of the things you noticed or experienced in doing this little practice. And I'll just give you maybe 2 minutes to just jot down some notes, some observations about what you experienced. There's absolutely no right or wrong. Whatever you experienced is what you experienced. And so just jot down what you experienced. And like I said, I'll give you 2 minutes, about 2 minutes to do that. And finish up whatever you were writing. And actually, I'd like you to write one last thing. Now write down the poem itself. Write down the poem itself. Last thing to write down. Just write down the poem itself. Okay, so let's come back together now. And this is a good time if you want to share some of your reflections, observations, comments, questions. This is a good time. And Maya, do you want to say anything again about how the participants can share those reflections and observations?
Yeah, sure. So, as Rick said, once you're ready to share, you can submit your reflections into the question box, which should be in your control panel, probably on the right side of your screen. I do see some coming in already, so that's a good sign.
Great, good. Thank you, Maya. So if we were together, I would actually then invite you all to share with me, and I would listen and respond and reflect together with you. But since we're not, I'm going to start by sharing with you some things that you might have experienced. I'm not sure if any of these are your experiences, but they might have been. I have done this practice. I've used phrase practices a lot in my class, but the first time ever this semester, I've had students memorize poems lots in classes, but never this way. This semester, for the first time, I had students memorize this little poem in class on the spot and do this exercise in the context of something else we were doing. And so I know from their experiences, and I know from previous experiences working with phrases, things that could. So what are some things that might have happened? You might have been carried away by the poem. What does that mean? You might have been taken off into some memories or some associations that were triggered by one or another of the words in the poem. And here I've shared with you a few of the words that could possibly have evoked a memory or an association or some kind of thinking or questioning. The words be or rose petal, settle, sip, fly, happiness, little. And any one of these words might have taken you on a journey away from the language of the poem itself. Even if you were keeping the words going quietly in the background with another part of your brain, you might have been off in these memories or associations. And this we can think of as being carried away by the poem. The poem sends you off into a journey. There are some other possibilities. You might have been drawn toward the poem, and you might even have had some experiences, moments of being with the poem, where the language itself is calling your attention toward it. And what are some of the things that you might have noticed if you were drawn toward the poem and you actually spent a little time being with the poems? So let's go back to the poem just for a second. A bee settled on a rose petal. It sipped and off it flew. All in all, happiness too is something little. So all kinds of things you might have noticed if your attention was drawn to the poem. You might have noticed the poem rhymes: settled, petal, little, flew, and two. You might have noticed some internal repetition of sounds: it, sipped, it, or all in all. You might have noticed that sometimes the poem seemed to speed up a little bit. Sometimes it seemed to slow down a little bit. And sometimes it seemed to be moving at what might be considered for this little poem, its kind of median pace or whatever, a regular, normal pace. A bee settled on a rose petal seems to be like the standard pace, for the poem. But then what happens when we get to all in all? Happiness too. It slows down and stretches out. Wow. And we can feel that in our bodies if we're drawn to the language and if we have a chance to be with the poem. And then right after it says that, which is kind of the slowest and longest and most drawn out line of the whole poem, all in all, happiness too is something little. It zips right by. Something little is something little. Fastest line in the poem, right? What experience might that be giving us? The pacing, the movement of the poem. What is the experience it's giving us of what happiness is? Happiness expansive. When we experience happiness, we experience a sense of expansiveness. Oh, and fleeting and temporary and impermanent is something little. You might have noticed that the poem also, first three lines, images. We can see things. A bee settled, rose petal, sipped, flew. Those are all things we can see, emotions. And then last two lines, little statements. So these are some things you could notice if you're being drawn to the poem and if you're being with the poem. And then another thing that could happen, and it might not have happened because we did it for such a short period of time, but you might have had the experience of finding the poem in you. And that's when you know it's in your heart, where you start to experience the words of the poem saying themselves, as it were. Well, with another part of your awareness, you're just paying attention to these words that are being said inside you. You're not the one saying them. They're saying themselves, and you're listening. So I don't know if that's what you experience, but maybe it is. Maybe one or another of these things uh, is descriptive of something you might have experienced. So let's now see if I can turn to any of the comments. I don't really see many questions or comments here. I just see Maya. Can you help me out here? I see very, very little here. Just one comment. What's that?
There were actually many. So the questions box didn't pop out for you?
It's here, but it's just not showing. It's only showing me the last thing I can see says visualizing and also listening to the structure.
Okay. Well, maybe if you scroll around a little bit, you can find the other ones.
Okay, I'm going to try. Sorry, everybody, but I'm trying my best here to find these things. I don't understand the question. We'll follow it up with you after the webinar. Okay, let's see. Maya said, nah. Hi, Sophia. Unfortunately, no, but I hope Rick will read some out loud. Um, I,
Okay, well, you got a few. If it's helpful, I can read some
yeah,
if if you
please do.
can't find them. Okay. Um, so one of the first ones that came in was all in all, if we take life and experience as a whole, happiness is wholeness.
Beautiful observation. And that, is one of those comments about a meaning, right? Finding meaning in the poem. That maybe happiness is experienced when we take all of life and are able to hold all of it. I hope I'm reflecting back the beautiful insight or comment shared by that participant. Keep going, because I can't see
Sure,
any of them.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, I also shared this experience. At the end, I noticed myself smiling.
Ah,
Um, Contrast of vowels in sipped it flew with all in all. In next line, broader sounds felt in heart.
yeah, that's awesome. That's fantastic. So, part of the material nature, of course, of language and of a poem, which is taking full advantage, is bringing all the resources of the language into play, is the contrast between sounds. It, sipped, it, short, closed, compressed sounds. Contrast that to all in all, these open, expansive, liquid sounds compared to these dentals, right, and sipped. Beautiful observation. And being able to train one's attention and tune one's way of paying attention to the music of the language is a really important skill and practice for many reasons, not the least of which is that it really helps you get closer to the poem, but it also helps the poem get closer to you. And when I talk about being, finding a sense of intimacy in a time of social distancing, we can experience, I think, a little bit of intimacy in relation to language when we tune our ears to hear the music of the language. And it's not always sounds that are just repeating, but it's also the contrast and variety of sounds.
Mhm.
Beautiful. Keep going, Maya, if there's some others.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. These two that I was getting ready to share kind of relate to that last one and what you were just saying. The first one is that this individual likes to create hand gestures with the poems that they memorize that illustrate it. And once they do that, they never forget it. It's a dance of the hands.
Wow. Beautiful. I love it. I mean, that goes right back to that passage from Deuteronomy about bind them on your arm and around and in between your eyes, bind those words to figure out a way to embody the language of the poem, whatever that means for you. And then there's body memory that goes along with the words themselves. Beautiful,
Mhm.
fantastic. Um,
Yeah.
I hope, for those of you who submitted these, that my responses are reflecting my clear understanding and hearing of what you are sharing with us. And if I'm not hearing you correctly, I deeply apologize for that. Okay, Maya, maybe some
hmm
more, if
hmm
there are more.
Oh, yes, there are many more. I became aware of the sounds of the words. As the subtle rhymes revealed themselves, it became easier for me to memorize. The
Yeah.
sweetness of the poem came through.
Yeah, beautiful. And the sweetness in part. There's so many things about this poem that make it sweet, not the least of which is its subtle sounds, right? This isn't a poem that hits you over the head, with loud sounds and super obvious and super noticeable rhymes the first one or two times through. And I love that saying, I became aware of the subtle sounds, right? That's something that you might not notice when you're reading the poem on the page to yourself one time. That's something you may only begin to notice when you're hearing the poem said aloud over and over and over again. Again, letting go of the desire, the yearning to quote unquote understand the poem. I mean, I said earlier that that word, about gaining mastery over the language, over the phrase that Norman uses. I've used that same term many times in my classes when I'm teaching. I teach mostly undergraduates, not only, but mostly undergraduates. And many times when I'm teaching students who are beginning to learn to do really rich, lively, close readings of poems, that students want, after they hear a poem or read it on the page, encounter it for the first time, they want to go directly to what it quote unquote means. And I understand that. I see that as like a yearning to master what is uncomfortable, what is difficult, what is challenging, what might be elusive, what might be ambiguous. And they want to be able to quickly reduce it to one sentence or two sentences of what it means, which completely strips away the living experience, the felt experience, which actually doesn't necessarily come in the form of language of the poem itself. And it's these other aspects of the poem that really can get inside the heart so that they're there for you, these poems, these texts you've memorized, when you're having an experience, a random experience, sad or happy, challenging or easy, and it's an experience that's coming not in the form of words, and suddenly, without your reaching, the words of the poem come up on their own and enable you to meet, to see clearly, and to name the experience you're having at the moment. I went off on a little bit of a tangent from that comment, but that's a beautiful comment. And I especially love, as I said at the beginning, because it suggests that there's a process. Something happens over time by hanging out with the poem and allowing it to sink inside the body and get onto and into the heart. Let's see. Okay, we're getting close on time. So we're going to stop on the questions and my comments right now, because I do want to share two last things with you before we wrap up today. And one of the things is that I want to say something about this photograph. And while this doesn't directly have anything to do with getting a poem into your heart, it does have to do with the lingering effects of planting something deeply inside you. So this photograph, I took this in my front yard last Thursday afternoon. It's a redbud tree, leafing out. We've lived, my wife and I, my family have lived in this house for 16 years. I've seen that tree hundreds and hundreds of times. Never once noticed the shape of the leaves before. Now that should tell you something about me. I've been working pretty hard, thinking about by heart, by heart, by heart. What does it mean to know a poem by heart? What does it mean to know a prayer by heart, to know a hymn by heart, know a psalm by heart, or whatever? I'm thinking about this webinar. And the other day when my wife and I were heading out of the house for a walk around the neighborhood, we're having great walks. One of the beautiful things, coming out of this very difficult and trying and scary time. And suddenly I had this kind of flash of perception. I saw all these hearts growing on this tree. And I didn't think anything. I just saw it. And then shortly after seeing it, I thought of John Hollander's poem called By Heart. And I thought of my presentation today, this webinar, By Heart. And I thought of a bee settled on a rose petal. It sipped and off it flew. All in all, happiness too is something little. And the happiness that I experienced, it was little. It was intense and expansive when I saw this image. But as I was trying now to capture, get the right photograph or whatever, I realized, the intensity of the happiness that I saw when my eyes and my heart and my mind met these leaves. It was intense for a moment, and then it was gone. Why is it worth knowing a poem by heart? When you're reading the poem on the page, you can have that heart-opening experience. When you're hearing the poem read aloud by a good reader, the poet or another reader, in person or on a podcast, listen to Tracy K. Smith, listen to Padraig Otuma's podcasts about poetry on being, right? When you're hearing the poem read aloud, you can have that experience in the moment when you're being engaged with the poem. But then when the poem is over and when you walk away from it and you're just remembering generally the poem and the feeling it evoked, the feeling is going to diminish over time. The intensity, the clarity, the eye-opening, heart-opening experience. You'll have a memory of it, but it's going to fade. But when you have that poem in your heart, you can awaken that feeling again and again and again. And in that way, when the poem is lodged with us, it might be useful sometimes for the work of getting a grip on fragile things. So I want to jump now to this poem. I'm going to skip over. You'll have these slides, everybody, if you're interested. But yeah, here's the poem by John Hollander. By Heart. The songs come at us first, and then the rhymed verses, like speech that half sings. Then the tunes. These first two lines could be and probably are describing poetry. The songs come at us first. And then the rhymed verses like speech that half sings. Then the tunes. And notice what happens next. The tunes of summer evening, the train whistles sigh, westering, fading as I lay in bed, sunset still creeping past the lowered shade, the gossip of swallows, the faint, the radioed reed section of a dance band through an open window down at the far end of the street, the good humor man's bells who tolled for me. And then the strings of digits we learned to keep like bunched keys, ready to unlock all the boxes we get assigned to us by the uncaring sheriffs of life itself. First stanza, notice that right after that dash, the tunes of summer evening, he's carried away. The language has launched him off into a memory, into childhood memories, right? Just like start saying words, the words may trigger memories and associations. And then he comes back. Just like this practice. We play by ear, but learn the words by heart. Visions we have by head. Yet even the sight of the remembered page, yet even when the sight of the remembered page has dimmed, the jingles that we gleaned from it, the music, for those of you who said, I became aware of the subtle sounds, the jingles that we gleaned from it remain lodged with us, useful sometimes for the work of getting a grip on certain fragile things. We are ourselves from birth committed to memory, to broad access to a past, framing and filling any presentness of self that we could really call our own. We grasp the world by ear, by heart, by head, and keep it in a soft continuingness that we first learn to get by soul or something. Bechol nafshecha, you shall love with all your soul. We first learn to get by soul. So that poem is the poem that gave me the title of this talk. And I have two dear colleagues of mine, Will Revere and Evan Gurney, a medievalist and early modernist in my English department, to thank for pointing me in the direction of this poem by John Hollander, a poet whose work I loved. And I'm sure I've read this poem before, but had forgotten it. And my colleagues and friends, Will and Evan, also told me all about the use of this expression by heart in the Middle Ages and in early modern writing. There's some other slides that I'm going to invite you to look at on your own, including some haiku. Who's got time to memorize even a sonnet right now? But you could memorize a few haiku, and when you start paying deep attention to haiku, they may also change the way you perceive those fleeting moments outside of you that might bring happiness, joy, delight, and beauty into your life. If you're interested in reading more about memorization and what links to some of the poems that John Hollander and a group of others recommend for memorization, you'll find all that on the Academy of American Poets website, easy to find. I'm not going to say anything about this, but this is the class in which I used this very exercise, and it was like an unbelievable experience for the students and for me. And most importantly, now from the bottom of my heart, I want to express my gratitude and say thank you to Maya, Carrie, and Leela at SeaMind. I want to say thank you to my dear friend David Levy, who may or may not be here and didn't have anything directly to do with this presentation, but in a deep way had everything to do with this presentation. I want to say thank you to all of my teachers and friends in the SeaMind community. I want to say thank you to participants of this webinar. And I want to refer to the great African-American poet Marilyn Nelson, who says this: "My prayer every day is simply thanks." So thank you for your attention. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for your generosity.
And thank you, Rick, from the bottom of our hearts for sharing that with us today. That was just a wonderful experience. So I want to just quickly remind everyone that the webinar was recorded and will be available on the website soon. And as Rick mentioned, the PowerPoint slides will also be available for you to reference after the fact. Our webinars are made possible by your support, so we invite you to make a donation and check out our extensive webinar archive at contemplativemind.org. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, Rick, and be well.
Thank you, Maya.